In Fresno, California, a family tragedy shocked an entire community. On one fateful night, jealousy and rivalry tore a family apart, leaving a young mother and her newborn child dead. This gripping true crime story uncovers the secrets, the planning, and the shocking reality behind a sibling betrayal that stunned the nation. In the quiet neighborhoods of Southwest Fresno, California, life often moved at an unassuming pace. Families shared barbecues in backyards, children played on sidewalks, and the rhythm of daily life seemed ordinary, almost comforting. Yet, behind the closed doors of one home on September 24, 2022, a tragedy was quietly taking shape, one that would shake the community and expose the darker complexities of family relationships. The Solorio Rivera family, like many others in Fresno, appeared to be close-knit on the surface. Siblings Yareli and Yaneli Solorio Rivera shared the same household at different times in their lives, and while there was a bond between them, there were also undercurrents of rivalry that, according to authorities, would ultimately have devastating consequences. Yareli Solorio Rivera, at 22 years old, had a life that seemed intertwined with both ambition and challenges common among young adults in the region. She had relationships, social connections, and plans for the future, but law enforcement and court documents later revealed a tension within the family, particularly surrounding her younger sister, Yaneli, who was 18 at the time. Yaneli had recently become a mother to a newborn, Celine, just 3 weeks old, bringing new joy and responsibility into her life. Yet, according to investigators, Yareli's emotions toward her sister and the infant were complicated, tinged with jealousy and resentment, emotions that had built gradually over time. Martin Arroyo Morales, Yareli's boyfriend, was a 26-year-old man who would later become a central figure in the events that unfolded that night. According to Fresno police reports, he and Yareli shared a relationship that went beyond companionship. They were collaborators in planning the tragic events that would occur. While the couple had their own lives outside the Solorio Rivera household, their interactions with Yaneli and her baby became a focal point for the tensions simmering beneath the surface. Authorities would later describe Martin's involvement as integral, noting that his presence in Yareli's life played a role in both the planning and execution of the crime. On the evening of September 24th, the atmosphere inside the home appeared normal to neighbors. Windows glowed with the warm light of domestic life, and the quiet of night settled over the streets. Inside, Yaneli was asleep with her newborn daughter, Celine, who was only a few weeks old. The infant's presence, fragile and dependent, symbolized the beginning of a new chapter for Yaneli, a chapter that would tragically be cut short. Surveillance and witness accounts later indicated that Yareli and Martin had coordinated in advance, moving deliberately through the house with the intent that investigators would later describe as planned and intentional. The charges that would be filed against both individuals reflected the severity of their actions and the premeditation involved. For many in Fresno, the shocking aspect of the crime was not just that it occurred, but who was involved. It was a case in which family members, bound by blood, became perpetrators and victims in a devastating chain of events. Yaneli, the younger sister, and Celine, the newborn, were both taken in circumstances that stunned neighbors, friends, and extended family. Fresno Police Chief Paco Balderrama later described the scene as traumatic for all officers who responded, emphasizing that even professionals accustomed to confronting violence were deeply affected. The presence of an infant, a symbol of innocence and new life, made the case particularly poignant and unsettling for the community. Beyond the immediate crime scene, investigators began piecing together the emotional and relational dynamics that led to the tragedy. Jealousy and sibling rivalry were cited as the primary motives by law enforcement. These were not impulsive emotions but patterns that had developed over time. Court documents would later highlight disputes, disagreements, and a growing tension between Yareli and Yaneli, suggesting that the relationship between the sisters had long been strained. The arrival of Celine, the new baby, intensified these dynamics, becoming a focal point in the complex web of emotions that Yareli reportedly struggled to manage. As authorities collected evidence, surveillance footage became crucial in establishing Martin's role in the events. Video captured him leaving the home that night, providing tangible proof of his involvement and corroborating witness statements. The collaboration between Yarely and Martin, combined with the detailed evidence collected, allowed the Fresno County District Attorney's Office to file felony complaints quickly. Both Yarely and Martin faced multiple counts of serious charges, including murder and special circumstance enhancements. These legal actions reflected the gravity of the crime and the meticulous work of investigators and prosecutors in building a case that would eventually lead to convictions. Community reaction was a mixture of grief, shock, and disbelief. Friends of the family struggled to reconcile the idea that such a tragedy could occur within a single household. The involvement of an infant made the case particularly difficult for the public to process, as many questioned how familial bonds could deteriorate to such a point. Local media covered the story extensively, highlighting not only the events themselves but also the broader implications of sibling rivalry, jealousy, and emotional tension within families. For many, the case became a cautionary tale about the potential consequences of unresolved conflicts and deep-seated emotional struggles. Throughout part one of this story, the focus remains on understanding the people involved and the circumstances that led to the crime. Yarely, motivated by complex emotions and a sense of rivalry toward her younger sister, engaged Martin in a plan that would have tragic consequences. Yanely, a young mother navigating the early days of parenthood, and her newborn daughter, Celine, became the victims of an act that shocked a community and highlighted the fragility of familial relationships. In the next part, the focus will shift to the night of the tragedy itself, the unfolding investigation, and the initial responses of law enforcement and neighbors, providing a detailed account of how events escalated and the immediate aftermath that reverberated throughout Fresno. The night of September 24, 2022, in southwest Fresno began like many others, with the calm quiet of a neighborhood settling in for sleep. Yet, for the Solario Rivera family, the hours ahead would transform the ordinary into a tragedy that would forever mark their lives and the community. In the home, 18-year-old Yanely Solario Rivera was asleep with her 3-week-old daughter, Celine. Outside the walls of that household, the world was unaware of the storm brewing inside. An emotional storm fueled by long-standing family tension, jealousy, and unresolved rivalries. Authorities later detailed that Yarely Solario Rivera, the 22-year-old older sister, had been planning this night carefully with her boyfriend, 26-year-old Martin Arroyo Morales. The planning, as revealed in court filings, was deliberate. It was not an impulsive act of rage but a sequence of steps taken with forethought. Investigators determined that Yarely and Martin had coordinated their actions in advance, an arrangement that would ultimately leave both of them facing the most serious charges under California law. Surveillance footage, witness accounts, and physical evidence collected by police painted a chilling picture of the careful execution of their plan. Neighbors reported nothing unusual in the hours leading up to the event. Lights glimmered from windows, and the occasional sounds of a television or conversation inside the home suggested normal family life. Yet, inside the Solario Rivera household, the tensions that had simmered for months, and perhaps years, reached their breaking point. For Yarely, feelings of jealousy toward her younger sister and the newborn child were now entwined with the presence of her boyfriend, who was drawn into the dynamic. The combination of emotions and planning set the stage for what investigators would later describe as a premeditated act of family violence. When the tragic events unfolded, Yanely and Celine were sleeping peacefully, unaware of the danger approaching. Court documents indicated that Yarely used a 9mm handgun, and according to police statements, she discharged it while both victims were in bed. The aftermath was devastating. Yanely was found deceased, clutching her baby, while Celine, only weeks old, also lost her life. The scene, described by law enforcement, was intensely distressing. Fresno Police Chief Paco Balderrama commented on the profound impact the incident had on responding officers, noting that even seasoned professionals were affected by the intensity of the crime. The loss of life within a family home, particularly involving a newborn, created a ripple effect of shock and grief throughout the neighborhood. Immediately following the incident, the response of law enforcement was swift. Officers arrived at the residence, securing the scene and beginning the meticulous work of collecting evidence. The home was treated as a crime scene of the highest priority, with investigators documenting every detail. Ballistic evidence, surveillance footage, and witness testimonies became central to understanding the sequence of events. It was clear to authorities that this was not a spontaneous act but one that had been carefully planned and executed. Every step taken by Yarely and Martin was later analyzed to establish the premeditated nature of the crime, which would be crucial for legal proceedings. Community members who learned of the tragedy described a mix of disbelief and sorrow. Friends, neighbors, and extended family grappled with the idea that a young mother and her infant could be lost in such circumstances. Many expressed confusion over how sibling relationships, which are typically associated with care and support, could deteriorate into acts of violence. The case prompted discussions about the complexities of family dynamics, the influence of jealousy, and the potential consequences when emotional tensions remain unresolved. Local media coverage brought these issues into public attention, providing a lens through which the community could process both the specific tragedy and broader societal concerns. The legal framework surrounding the case quickly took shape. Yarely was charged with 2 counts of murder, each accompanied by enhancements for the personal, intentional discharge of a firearm causing death. Martin, her boyfriend, faced similar charges, including special circumstance allegations due to the multiple victims involved. The filing of charges was accompanied by detailed documentation from the Fresno County District Attorney's Office, which outlined the premeditated nature of the crime and the sequence of events as investigators understood them. These filings provided insight into the prosecutor's perspective on motive, planning, and responsibility, setting the stage for courtroom proceedings that would follow over the next several years. Despite the overwhelming weight of the evidence, Yarely's defense offered an alternative narrative. Her counsel argued that her actions were influenced by fear and perceived threats, and that she may have acted under complex emotional pressures rather than pure malice. This narrative, while contested by the prosecution, highlighted the nuanced nature of familial and psychological dynamics that often play a role in tragic outcomes. Legal teams examined not only the physical evidence but also the emotional and relational context, emphasizing the importance of understanding the broader circumstances that contributed to the night's events. The public response to the arrests was intense. On November 9, 2022, Yarely and Martin were formally booked into Fresno County Jail. Community members followed the case closely, many expressing a desire for accountability, while others sought to understand the underlying causes of such a familial tragedy. Media outlets covered the story extensively, including updates on court filings, surveillance evidence, and official statements from law enforcement. The combination of local attention and the human interest element, the loss of a young mother and her infant, ensured that the case would remain a focus of both legal and social discourse in Fresno for months to come. Beyond the courtroom and community discussions, the impact on the Solario Rivera family itself was profound. Extended family members were left to cope with the loss of Yanely and Celine, while also confronting the reality that Yarely, a sibling, was responsible. The family's grief was compounded by public attention, as media coverage made the tragedy both personal and visible to the wider community. Counselors and social workers were engaged to provide support to those affected, emphasizing the need for emotional care in addition to the pursuit of justice. As investigations continued, law enforcement emphasized the importance of understanding the dynamics that lead to family violence. While the immediate legal focus was on Yarely and Martin, broader questions emerged regarding the role of emotional tension, jealousy, and interpersonal conflicts within households. The Fresno case became a point of reference for discussions on preventive measures, early intervention, and community support systems that might mitigate similar tragedies in the future. In Part 2, the story has examined the critical night of September 24, 2022, the immediate response of law enforcement, and the legal actions initiated against Yarely and Martin. The focus has been on reconstructing events, understanding character motivations, and presenting the factual framework of the case in a documentary style. Part 3 will explore the legal proceedings in detail, the sentencing outcomes, and the longer-term impact on both the Solario Rivera family and the Fresno community, completing the comprehensive account of this tragic and complex case. Following the arrests of Yarely Solario Rivera and Martin Arroyo Morales, The Fresno community braced itself for the legal proceedings that would follow, fully aware of the gravity of the crimes and the emotional weight carried by all involved. The case moved quickly through the Fresno County judicial system, and each stage of the trial revealed more about the complex family dynamics, the motivations behind the tragedy, and the painstaking work of prosecutors, defense attorneys, and investigators who had meticulously documented the events of September 24, 2022. The legal process became not only a search for justice but also a lens through which the community could examine the destructive potential of unresolved family conflict. Yarely faced 2 counts of murder, each with special circumstance enhancements for the intentional use of a firearm causing death, as well as charges tied to multiple victims. Martin was charged similarly, reflecting the authorities' determination that both had played central roles in the crime. Prosecutors presented a narrative grounded in premeditation and emotional motivation, describing how jealousy and sibling rivalry had escalated into violence. Evidence included surveillance footage, eyewitness accounts, and the detailed forensic analysis conducted at the scene. Courtroom exhibits demonstrated the level of planning involved, from the procurement and handling of the firearm to the coordinated actions taken that night. Throughout the trial, the defense counsel for Yarely emphasized her emotional state and attempted to contextualize her actions within a framework of fear and perceived threats. They argued that while the outcomes were tragic, Yarely's decisions were influenced by complex psychological pressures rather than simple malice. Martin's defense presented similar arguments, noting the dynamics of influence and partnership between the 2 individuals. The courtroom became a venue not just for presenting facts, but also for exploring the nuanced and often difficult-to-define interplay of emotions, relationships, and accountability that had culminated in the loss of 2 lives within a single family. The testimonies provided by neighbors, family members, and first responders offered additional layers of understanding. Officers described the scene with careful professionalism, noting both the physical and emotional challenges involved in processing the events. Extended family members shared their perspectives on the siblings' relationship, highlighting past conflicts and unresolved tensions that had been present long before the night of the tragedy. Psychologists and social workers consulted by the court provided insight into family dynamics, emotional stressors, and potential triggers that may have influenced Yarely's behavior, helping the jury consider the broader context without diminishing the severity of the acts. As the trial unfolded, the focus of public attention remained intense. Media coverage documented each stage of the proceedings, from arraignment to courtroom hearings, and public interest centered not only on the legal outcomes but also on the social implications of the case. Discussions emerged regarding the challenges of addressing jealousy and rivalry within families, the importance of emotional support and conflict resolution, and the potential warning signs that can precede acts of severe domestic violence. The involvement of a newborn made the case particularly poignant, and many commentators highlighted the need for community resources to prevent similar tragedies. By October 2025, after 3 years of investigation, pretrial motions, and negotiations, resolutions were reached in both cases. Yarely Solario Rivera accepted a plea deal, resulting in 2 consecutive life sentences in prison for the murders of her sister, Yanely, and her infant niece, Celine. The plea agreement reflected a recognition of the premeditated nature of her actions while allowing for certain procedural efficiencies within the court system. Martin Arroyo Morales received a 22-year sentence for voluntary manslaughter under a separate plea agreement, acknowledging his involvement while differentiating the level of responsibility between the 2 defendants. These outcomes brought a measure of closure to a community that had watched the events unfold with a mix of grief, shock, and concern. Beyond the courtroom, the impact of the tragedy continued to resonate. The Solario Rivera family, already deeply affected by the deaths, faced the additional challenge of reconciling with the reality of one sibling being responsible for the loss of another. Family members sought counseling and support to process the grief and trauma, while neighbors and the broader Fresno community reflected on the emotional and relational factors that had contributed to the crime. The case became a reference point for educators, social workers, and law enforcement officials seeking to understand and prevent family-based tragedies, highlighting the importance of early intervention and support for families experiencing tension or conflict. The community also engaged in conversations about justice, accountability, and healing, While the legal system provided sentencing and formal recognition of the crimes, the emotional aftermath required ongoing attention. Support groups, counseling services, and community outreach programs played roles in helping residents cope with the emotional weight of the case. Public discourse often focused on the warning signs of sibling rivalry and jealousy, emphasizing the need for families to address conflicts before they escalate. In this way, the case served as both a cautionary tale and a call to action for greater awareness of familial dynamics. Ultimately, the tragedy of September 24, 2022, is remembered not only for the lives lost but also for the complex interplay of human emotions that contributed to the events. Yarely Solario Rivera and Martin Arroyo Morales' actions demonstrate the potential consequences when jealousy, rivalry, and emotional tension go unchecked. The legal resolution, while providing accountability, does not erase the profound sense of loss felt by the victim's extended family and the community at large. In reflecting on this case, both scholars and lay people alike consider the lessons it imparts about communication, conflict resolution, and the fragile nature of family relationships. In conclusion, the Solario Rivera case stands as a somber example of how deeply human emotions, when combined with poor judgment and inadequate conflict resolution, can lead to irreversible consequences. The sentencing of Yarely and Martin, while providing a measure of justice, also serves as a reminder of the broader responsibilities families, communities, and support systems hold in preventing tragedies. The lives of Yanely and Celine remain a testament to innocence lost, and the case continues to inform discussions on familial relationships, emotional health, and the importance of intervention in situations marked by tension, jealousy, and rivalry. The Fresno community, forever touched by this event, carries forward the lessons of vigilance, compassion, and the need to address conflicts before they reach a point of no return. A quiet Sydney suburb, two loving sisters, and a moment that changed everything. What began as an ordinary morning spiraled into one of Australia's most heartbreaking family tragedies. This is the haunting true story of the Worrell sisters, where love, illness, and fate collided in a single, irreversible moment. The suburb of Strathfield in Sydney's inner west was known for its quiet streets, lined with family homes and leafy driveways. It was the kind of place where neighbors exchanged polite greetings, and life followed a predictable rhythm. In October 2008, that peace was shattered in a way no one could have imagined. Inside one of those quiet homes lived the Worrell family, a mother and her two daughters, Kathleen and Susan. They were a typical household by all appearances, living modestly, keeping to themselves, and rarely causing concern. Yet, behind the closed doors of their small home, a silent struggle had been growing for months, one that no one around them fully understood. Kathleen Worrell, the elder sister at 22, had always been the more reserved of the two. Those who knew her described her as intelligent and polite, though quiet. She had once shown great promise in school but had been struggling with mental health challenges that often made her withdrawn and unpredictable. Her diagnosis was known to a few close family members, a form of mental illness that required regular medication to manage her moods and thoughts. For a time, treatment had worked, and the household settled into a careful routine. But as sometimes happens, stability led to complacency, and complacency led to neglect. In the weeks before the tragedy, Kathleen had stopped taking her medication. Her mother noticed small signs, a distant look, occasional agitation, but believed it was just a passing phase. Susan Worrell, only 18, was the opposite in temperament. Bright, confident, and full of energy. She had just finished school and was eager to begin the next chapter of her life. Her friends described her as the kind of person who brought light into a room. She was close to her mother and even to Kathleen, though their relationship had always been marked by small tensions, the kind that come naturally when two sisters share space and different personalities. Despite that, they shared a bond that most would describe as normal. There were laughs, late-night talks, and moments of care between them, but underneath lingered an invisible distance that mental illness often creates. On the morning of October 5, 2008, the day began like any other. It was spring in Sydney, and the air carried a soft warmth through the open windows of the Worrell home. Mrs. Worrell had left for her morning errands, leaving the sisters to their routine. Inside, music played faintly from a bedroom, and the smell of breakfast lingered in the kitchen. Kathleen moved through the house quietly, her thoughts restless, her emotions unsettled. In another room, Susan was preparing to meet a friend later that day. Somewhere between those small, ordinary moments, a spark of tension was struck. The argument began over something trivial, a household item they both used regularly, a hair straightener. It was an object neither of them cared deeply about, yet in that moment it became the center of their disagreement. Voices rose, words grew sharp, and the tension that had quietly built for months found an outlet. For Susan, it was an ordinary sibling quarrel, one she expected to pass as quickly as it began. For Kathleen, in her fragile mental state, the argument took on a magnitude that didn't match reality. In her mind, the conversation spiraled into confusion and emotional chaos. Neighbors would later recall hearing shouting from the house, followed by an eerie silence. What happened next unfolded in a matter of moments but would alter every life connected to that home. When Mrs. Worrell returned not long after, the scene that greeted her was beyond comprehension. Susan was lying on the floor, gravely injured. Kathleen was nearby, frozen in shock, holding a kitchen knife as if she herself couldn't believe what had just happened. Her mother's scream broke the stillness that had filled the house. Paramedics were called immediately, but by the time help arrived, Susan's injuries were too severe. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Police officers entered a home that felt suspended in time. Kathleen appeared disoriented, her speech fragmented, her understanding of what had occurred clouded by distress and confusion. She did not resist arrest, nor did she seem to fully grasp the reality of her sister's death. For the officers, it was clear they weren't dealing with a cold-blooded act of violence, but something far more complicated. A sudden tragedy born from an unstable state of mind. As news of the incident spread, the community of Strathfield was left stunned. Neighbors who had once seen the sisters walking together couldn't comprehend what had gone wrong. Friends of Susan gathered outside the home, placing flowers and notes on the fence. Some described her as the kindest person they knew. Others remembered Kathleen as sweet but distant. The contrast between their public image and the tragedy inside their home was too painful to reconcile. When investigators pieced together the evidence, they found no signs of premeditation or long-standing hostility. The crime was spontaneous, triggered by a momentary argument that collided with an untreated mental health crisis. It was a devastating reminder of how fragile the balance within a family can be when illness goes untreated or unrecognized. In the days following the incident, Kathleen was placed under psychiatric evaluation. Her mother, despite her unbearable grief, cooperated fully with the authorities, providing details about Kathleen's medical history and the struggles the family had faced in trying to manage her care. She spoke of doctor visits, medication routines, and the hope that her daughter would one day live a normal life. But now, one daughter was gone, and the other was facing criminal charges. As the investigation deepened, detectives noted how little malice there was in Kathleen's behavior. She showed remorse, confusion, and periods of emotional collapse. Psychological assessments later revealed that her decision-making abilities had been significantly impaired by her condition and her failure to take medication. The court would later focus heavily on these findings, but for now, all that remained was a family broken by loss. The local media covered the story extensively, yet even journalists approached it with restraint. There was no mystery to solve, no hidden motive to uncover. Only a tragedy that seemed both preventable and deeply human. The Worrell home became a quiet symbol of grief. Behind closed curtains, Mrs. Worrell mourned her daughters. One lost forever, and one consumed by guilt and illness. As the first days of October faded into weeks, the case moved from the scene of tragedy to the slow process of legal examination. The headlines shifted from shock to analysis, as mental health experts began to speak publicly about the dangers of medication lapses and the lack of community support for families facing similar struggles. What had started as a family argument was now becoming a case study in how fragile the line can be between safety and catastrophe. For the Worrell family, nothing would ever be the same. The house on the quiet Strathfield Street, once filled with laughter and the ordinary sounds of life, had become a place of silence. A silence that told a story more powerful than words ever could. In the weeks that followed the tragedy, the Worrell home remained a quiet, sealed-off reminder of what had happened. Police tape was long gone, but the air of sorrow still lingered in the neighborhood. The blinds stayed closed, the mailbox overflowed, and neighbors who once exchanged friendly greetings now whispered in subdued tones. For Mrs. Worrell, every corner of the house carried the echo of her daughters. Susan's laughter that once filled the kitchen, and Kathleen's calm voice, now replaced by silence. What had once been a home had become a place of mourning and confusion, where love and loss coexisted painfully. Kathleen was taken to a psychiatric facility after her arrest. Doctors and investigators observed her behavior closely, noting her fragile emotional state. She spoke softly, often breaking down mid-sentence, unable to comprehend how a simple argument had led to such an irreversible outcome. Her interviews with detectives were marked by long pauses and tears. There was no sign of denial or evasion. Rather, it was as if she was trying to piece together the fragments of a day she barely understood herself. As the case moved toward court, the question everyone wanted answered was not what had happened, but why. The prosecution reviewed evidence from the scene. The kitchen knife, the overturned items, the traces of a struggle that lasted only moments. It was clear that the act was not planned, but spontaneous. The medical reports confirmed that Kathleen had stopped taking her prescribed medication weeks earlier, despite her doctor's repeated advice. Her mother had tried to encourage her, but like many struggling with mental illness, Kathleen believed she was improving and no longer needed treatment. During her time in care, psychiatric specialists conducted detailed evaluations. They concluded that at the time of the incident, Kathleen's mental state was severely compromised. She suffered from hallucinations and disordered thoughts that blurred her grasp on reality. In moments of stress, her emotions could swing from calm to panic without warning. The argument with Susan, though small and unimportant, became overwhelming in her perception. It was as if her mind magnified every word, every tone, into something far greater than it was. Meanwhile, the media's coverage remained measured but persistent. Headlines focused not on violence, but on mental health awareness and the importance of treatment. News anchors spoke softly of the Worrell sisters' tragedy, framing it as a story of love, illness, and loss rather than a crime born of hatred. Viewers across Australia watched with a mix of sadness and empathy. Many families recognized in Kathleen's story the familiar struggle of managing a loved one's mental health. The appointments, the medications, the hopeful days followed by setbacks. In court, the proceedings began quietly. The courtroom was filled with reporters, legal professionals, and a few members of the public. At the front sat Mrs. Worrell, alone, her eyes downcast as she faced the unimaginable. Her surviving daughter sitting in the dock, charged with the death of her other child. Kathleen entered slowly, escorted by officers, her demeanor calm but detached. She avoided eye contact, her head bowed, her face pale under the harsh courtroom lights. The prosecution presented the facts with restraint. They described how the argument escalated, how the knife was taken from the kitchen, and how Susan was fatally injured. But even as they laid out the sequence of events, they did not push for a narrative of cruelty. The Crown prosecutor acknowledged Kathleen's documented mental illness and the medical evidence suggesting she was not in full control of her actions. This acknowledgement set the tone for the trial, one focused not on punishment, but on understanding and accountability within the context of illness. The defense, led by a seasoned barrister, presented a compassionate case. They emphasized Kathleen's long struggle with mental health, her history of compliance with medication, and the tragic relapse that led to her instability. Expert witnesses explained how missing medication could trigger a sharp decline, distorting perception and increasing impulsivity. They described how Kathleen's thought processes, at the time, were not rational or intentional, but driven by confusion and emotional overload. Her condition, they said, made her incapable of forming clear intent. As the expert testimonies unfolded, the courtroom fell into reflective silence. The judge listened carefully, often taking notes. It was evident that this was not a case about hatred or revenge, but about a human mind in crisis. When Kathleen's psychiatrist took the stand, he spoke about the months leading to the tragedy, her progress, her gradual withdrawal, and the warnings he had given about medication lapses. He noted that Kathleen had expressed feelings of isolation and fear, symptoms that might have intensified in the days before the incident. Outside the courtroom, public opinion grew more sympathetic. Comment sections and radio discussions shifted from judgment to empathy. Listeners called in to share their own experiences with family members battling mental illness, discussing how difficult it can be to maintain consistent treatment. The tragedy began to symbolize a larger social issue: how mental health is often misunderstood and undersupported, even in developed societies. Throughout the hearings, Mrs. Worrell remained composed, though her pain was visible in every expression. She listened to every word, her hands tightly clasped, her gaze alternating between the judge and her daughter. When asked to give a statement, she spoke softly, her voice trembling. She described both daughters with love: Susan as bright and spirited, Kathleen as gentle and intelligent but ill. She told the court that she had lost both children that day, one to death and the other to a condition beyond her control. Her statement left the courtroom in silence. Even those accustomed to hearing tragic testimony were moved by the mother's calm dignity. After weeks of deliberation, the prosecution and defense reached an agreement. The charge of murder was withdrawn, and Kathleen entered a plea of guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. This legal term acknowledged her role in the act while recognizing that her mental illness had severely impaired her judgment. The plea was accepted, and the focus shifted to sentencing. The judge, in his remarks, spoke with empathy and caution. He noted that the case was among the most tragic he had ever presided over, a story not of cruelty but of brokenness, where the system of care had failed to prevent disaster. He emphasized the need for better mental health awareness and for families to be supported, not left alone to navigate such challenges. Kathleen was sentenced to a period of institutional care rather than traditional imprisonment, ensuring she would receive treatment and monitoring in a secure environment. As the gavel came down, the courtroom felt both relieved and mournful. Justice had been served in the legal sense, but there was no real victory, only a sense of closure tinged with sorrow. The judge extended his condolences to Mrs. Worrell, acknowledging her strength and compassion. The family's tragedy had become a lesson for many, but for her, it was simply a wound that would never fully heal. When Kathleen was escorted out of court, she turned once to look at her mother. It was a small, fleeting glance, filled with regret and love. Her mother nodded gently, as if to say she understood. Outside, the cameras clicked, the reporters whispered, and the gray Sydney sky matched the mood of the day. For the Worrell family, life would go on, but never as it was before. In the months after the sentencing, the story of the Worrell sisters quietly faded from national headlines, but for those closest to it, the impact lingered like an echo that refused to fade. The Strathfield home stood as a silent monument to what had been lost, two sisters whose lives had become intertwined in tragedy. Mrs. Worrell, now living alone, spent her days surrounded by memories that brought both comfort and pain. Photographs lined the mantelpiece: Susan smiling in her school uniform, Kathleen with her hair tied back, looking proud and shy in the same frame. To outsiders, they were just pictures of two sisters. To their mother, they were reminders of what love and loss could do to a family when life takes a turn no one can control. Kathleen remained under supervised psychiatric care, in a secure facility designed to provide treatment rather than punishment. The structure of her days was calm and predictable: therapy sessions, medical check-ins, and quiet time for reflection. For the first time in years, her mind began to find stability. She spoke more clearly, engaged more often, and started to process the reality of what had happened. But with every step toward recovery came waves of guilt that no therapy could completely erase. Those who worked closely with her said that she often spoke about Susan, not with denial, but with deep sorrow. She expressed her wish that she could go back, take her medication, or simply walk away from that argument. Yet she knew that wishing could not undo what had been done. During one of her supervised visits, her mother came to see her. The meeting was quiet, emotional, and marked by the heavy silence that comes when words fall short. Kathleen apologized again and again, though her mother didn't need to hear the words. She had already forgiven her long ago, knowing that what happened was the result of illness, not cruelty. Still, forgiveness could not erase the emptiness left behind. They sat together for a long time, sometimes speaking, sometimes just holding hands. For both, it was a fragile kind of peace, one built not on forgetting but on understanding. Outside the family, the case continued to be discussed in professional and academic circles. Psychologists, social workers, and legal experts examined it as an example of how complex the intersection of mental health and criminal responsibility can be. In interviews and studies, the Worrell case was cited as a reminder that mental illness must be treated with consistency and care, that one missed dose, one lapse, can have consequences far beyond the individual. News programs revisited the story periodically, focusing on the broader lessons rather than the details of the tragedy itself. The tragedy also sparked quiet change in policy discussions. Health advocates in New South Wales began calling for stronger community outreach programs for families affected by psychiatric conditions. They argued that families like the Worrells often carry a hidden burden, managing crises alone until it's too late. Though change came slowly, the case became a touchstone in mental health education, used in training programs for healthcare professionals and law enforcement officers to help them recognize early signs of relapse or distress. Meanwhile, Kathleen's progress was steady but cautious. The medical team overseeing her care noted that she responded well to structured therapy. She joined art classes as part of her rehabilitation, painting quiet, abstract images, sometimes of faces, sometimes of landscapes, often filled with muted tones that reflected both calm and melancholy. Her doctors said that expressing herself through art became a way for her to release the weight of guilt she carried. She spoke less about punishment and more about responsibility, about learning, growing, and finding a way to honor her sister's memory through change rather than despair. For her mother, visiting her became a ritual of healing. Each visit brought mixed emotions: relief that Kathleen was improving, pain at the absence of Susan. She often brought flowers, placing them in the facility's small courtyard garden, where Kathleen liked to sit. They would talk about small things: the weather, a new book, or the family cat that now kept her mother company. Over time, their conversations became less about the tragedy and more about rebuilding something human from its ashes. As years passed, the memory of that October morning in 2008 remained vivid but less sharp. The story had transitioned from public tragedy to private endurance. In Strathfield, the house eventually changed owners. The new residents painted the walls, replaced the furniture, and filled it with their own laughter. The neighbors no longer spoke about the past, but for those who remembered, there was still a quiet respect whenever they walked by. Life continued as it always does, though some stories never truly end. They just become part of the background, lessons carried forward. When the time came for Kathleen's review hearing several years later, doctors testified to her stability and progress. She was described as cooperative, remorseful, and fully aware of her actions and their consequences. They recommended that her treatment continue in a less restrictive environment, allowing her to gradually reintegrate under supervision. The court agreed, and she was transferred to a community-based program where she could live with structured freedom. For the first time, she could see the world beyond hospital walls, a world that looked familiar yet changed. She was cautious, humble, and deeply introspective. Every decision, every word, was measured with the awareness of how fragile stability could be. The media did not cover this development widely, and perhaps that was a mercy. The Worrell family deserved privacy, and the story had already given the public enough to think about. In the quiet space left behind by fading headlines, the people involved began their slow, private paths to peace. Mrs. Worrell found comfort in volunteering for mental health awareness groups, speaking quietly to families who were struggling as she once had. She never sought attention or sympathy. She simply wanted others to know they weren't alone. Her voice carried the weight of experience and the compassion of someone who understood both the pain of loss and the importance of empathy. Kathleen, under continued care, participated in programs that supported awareness and recovery. Though she never appeared publicly, she contributed anonymously to a community art exhibit that focused on healing through creativity. One of her pieces, titled Sisters, featured two figures intertwined in soft colors, neither distinct nor separate. Viewers who saw it said it felt like forgiveness captured in paint. Quiet, painful, and hopeful. Over time, the Worrell case became less a headline and more a reminder that mental health isn't just an individual struggle but a family one. That tragedy can emerge from the smallest moments when illness goes untreated, and that behind every courtroom headline are human beings trying to understand and survive what life has taken from them. In later years, when asked privately about her daughters, Mrs. Worrell would often say that she chose to remember them as they once were. Two girls growing up together, laughing in the kitchen, borrowing each other's things, and dreaming about the future. That was how she wanted the world to remember them too. Not defined by a single day, but by the years they shared before it. For those who heard their story, the lesson was clear. That compassion must stand alongside justice, and that in every tragedy, there are layers of humanity waiting to be understood. The quiet streets of Strathfield eventually returned to normal, but in the hearts of those who knew the Worrell family, the story remained. A gentle, enduring reminder of how fragile peace can be, and how love, even through loss, can still endure. In the quiet town of Luton, a secret affair between two sisters' lives spiraled into a shocking act of betrayal. What began as love turned into envy, and envy into tragedy. This is the heartbreaking story of how jealousy within one family destroyed everything they once held dear. It was a mild spring evening in Luton, Bedfordshire. The kind of calm night when families wind down after long days. The hum of traffic fades into silence, and lights inside terraced homes glow softly against the dusk. Nothing in that quiet neighborhood hinted at the storm of emotions brewing behind one of those doors. Emotions that would soon lead to one of Britain's most tragic family murders. Saima Khan had always been seen as a gentle soul. At 34, she was the image of grace and patience. A loving mother of 4, devoted wife, and dedicated care assistant. Those who knew her described her as soft-spoken, humble, and deeply family-oriented. To the community, she represented stability. A woman who managed her responsibilities with quiet dignity. Her husband, Hafiz Rahman, a hardworking taxi driver, often worked late into the night to provide for their growing family. Together, they were seen as a respectable, modest couple. Living close by was Saima's younger sister, Sabah Khan. At 27, Sabah was unmarried, still living with her parents, and often present in her sister's home. She helped care for the children, cooked, and kept Saima company when Hafiz was away. To neighbors and relatives, she appeared loyal and caring, the kind of sister any woman would be lucky to have. Yet behind the surface of sibling affection, Sabah's emotions were far more complicated. What had begun as admiration for her sister's settled life slowly turned into envy, and that envy began to fester. Hafiz, juggling his work schedule, found in Sabah a listener, someone younger, eager to talk, and always available. Conversations turned into messages, and messages grew into something inappropriate. Before long, a secret affair had formed between them, one that would change the course of all their lives. For a time, they managed to keep their relationship hidden. But for Sabah, what started as a secret thrill became an emotional dependency. She fell deeply in love with Hafiz and began to see her sister not as family, but as competition. As months passed, the weight of secrecy grew heavier. Hafiz attempted to distance himself, realizing the danger of what he had done. He tried to return his focus to Saima and their children. But for Sabah, rejection only deepened her obsession. She began to feel that her sister had taken everything she ever wanted: the husband, the home, the respect. Her thoughts darkened, shifting from pain to anger, and finally, to resentment so deep it clouded her judgment. In the weeks leading up to May 2016, Sabah's behavior changed subtly but significantly. Those close to her noticed she became withdrawn. She spent long hours alone in her room, glued to her phone or computer. What they didn't know was that she was researching methods to carry out a plan that had taken root in her mind. Late at night, while her parents slept, Sabah read online articles and guides, ways to harm someone, ways to make it look like a burglary. Each search took her one step further down a path she couldn't return from. Her plan was chilling in its precision. She would choose a night when Hafiz was working late, when Saima would be at the mosque, and when the children would be home asleep. She convinced herself that once Saima was gone, everything would fall into place. Hafiz would turn to her, the family would still remain close, and the pain of jealousy would finally end. But this was not the thinking of someone rational. It was the thinking of a mind twisted by obsession and emotional desperation. On May 23rd, the evening began like any other. Saima attended prayers at the local mosque, a routine she followed faithfully. Meanwhile, Sabah stayed home, pacing, waiting, and preparing. She had already made up her story. One of the children wasn't feeling well. She would tell Saima over the phone. Knowing her sister's maternal nature, Sabah was certain she'd come home immediately. When Saima received the call, she didn't hesitate. She left the mosque early, concerned, unaware of what awaited her. The short drive home must have felt ordinary, perhaps filled with thoughts of checking on her child before bed. She could not have imagined that the person she loved and trusted most, her own sister, was waiting with dark intent. As the car pulled into the driveway, Sabah's heart pounded. This was the moment she had been building toward for weeks, yet it felt unreal. She stood inside the dimly lit hallway, listening as the front door opened. The sound of footsteps echoed. Saima called out softly, asking if everything was all right. Then, in a matter of moments, the home that had always been filled with warmth turned cold. What happened next would later be reconstructed through forensic evidence and Sabah's own confession. It was a sudden, uncontrolled explosion of rage. The reality of what she was doing may have hit her midway, but by then, there was no turning back. When silence finally fell, it was absolute. The life that had once been her sister's, the life she envied, admired, and despised all at once, was gone. Upstairs, the children slept, undisturbed by the tragedy unfolding beneath them. For a few moments, the house was still. Then panic took over. Sabah realized what she had done and rushed to disguise the truth. She broke a window, scattered a few items, and called the authorities, pretending to discover a break-in. Her voice trembled, but her mind was focused on survival. She thought she could outsmart the police, that she could rewrite what had just happened. When emergency services arrived, the scene was chaotic. The home appeared ransacked, but something felt off. Officers immediately noticed inconsistencies. The forced entry looked staged, and Sabah's explanation didn't match the evidence before them. Yet in that moment, she played her role convincingly, portraying herself as a terrified sister who had just stumbled upon tragedy. But detectives had questions, and soon, those questions would unravel every part of her story. The quiet street that evening had witnessed something unthinkable. Not an act of random violence, but a betrayal born within a family's walls. And as the investigation began, one truth would soon surface. Love and jealousy, when intertwined, can destroy everything they touch. The hours following the tragedy were filled with confusion, disbelief, and grief that seemed impossible to measure. Police officers sealed off the family home, blue lights flickering across the quiet street of Overstone Road. Word spread quickly through the local community that something terrible had happened at the Khan household. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, whispering in shock, unable to comprehend that the two sisters they had often seen together, laughing, shopping, attending mosque, were now at the center of such a horrific event. Inside the house, investigators began the painstaking process of documenting every detail. Detectives from the Bedfordshire Police Major Crime Unit immediately noted that something didn't feel right about the supposed burglary. There were signs of forced entry, yes, a broken window, scattered drawers, misplaced items, but the pattern didn't fit what they normally saw in genuine break-ins. Nothing valuable appeared to be missing, and the level of disruption seemed staged rather than chaotic. As officers questioned Sabah that night, her demeanor drew attention. She appeared upset, but not devastated. Her tone was controlled, her answers rehearsed. When asked to recount how she discovered her sister's body, she hesitated, glancing toward the ground, her voice barely a whisper. She said she had been home and heard noises, that she went to check and found the scene already done. She insisted she had no idea who could have done it. But something in her composure made detectives suspicious. Over the next few days, the investigation expanded rapidly. Forensic teams collected fingerprints, blood samples, and DNA evidence from around the home. Detectives began interviewing everyone connected to the family. Friends, relatives, colleagues, even neighbors who might have seen or heard anything unusual. Gradually, a clearer picture of family dynamics began to emerge. It was during these interviews that the first whispers of a possible motive surfaced. A friend mentioned that Sabah had been spending a lot of time at Saima's house, perhaps too much. Another recalled seeing her and Hafiz talking privately outside the home on several occasions. And then came the detail that changed the direction of the case. Someone had seen Sabah and Hafiz together in a way that didn't seem appropriate for in-laws. Detectives began to look closer at Hafiz. He was devastated by his wife's death, visibly broken when he spoke to police. But when asked about his relationship with his sister-in-law, he grew uneasy. He initially denied any wrongdoing, insisting that Sabah was like a younger sister to him. But investigators had already begun analyzing phone records, and what they found told a very different story. Thousands of text messages were exchanged between Hafiz and Sabah over several months. Some were affectionate, even romantic in tone. Others revealed tension. Moments when Hafiz appeared to be pulling away, and Sabah responded with frustration and emotional outbursts. One message, in particular, stood out. Sabah had written that she couldn't stand seeing Saima's face anymore. To detectives, that line revealed everything they needed to know about her mindset. With this new information, Sabah's version of events began to crumble. The police obtained CCTV footage from nearby properties, and on the night of the murder, it captured her movements in and around the house. She had claimed to be asleep at the time, but the footage showed her leaving and re-entering the home. Forensics also discovered her fingerprints in areas that contradicted her story, including on the knife handle recovered from the scene. When investigators confronted her with the evidence, Sabah's confidence wavered. She tried to explain the inconsistencies, saying she had panicked, that she had touched things while trying to help her sister. But as more proof emerged, her explanations grew weaker. The turning point came when digital analysts examined her computer. The search history was undeniable. Phrases such as, how to kill someone quickly, how to stage a burglary, and murder methods without getting caught appeared repeatedly in the days before Saima's death. By the end of the first week, detectives knew they were no longer dealing with a burglary gone wrong. They were dealing with premeditated murder. The next step was to confront Hafiz about the affair. In a tense interview, he finally broke down. He admitted he had been involved with Sabah but claimed he never believed she could be capable of something so extreme. He said he had ended the relationship because he regretted it and wanted to focus on his wife and children. His confession not only confirmed the emotional motive but also explained the growing resentment that had driven Sabah to the edge. When the police presented all of this to her, the messages, the search history, the CCTV footage, Sabah finally stopped resisting. After hours of silence, she lowered her head and quietly confessed. Her words were calm, almost emotionless, as she described how jealousy had taken over her life. She admitted to planning the attack, calling her sister home under false pretenses, and losing control in a fit of anger. But even in confession, she seemed detached, as if she still couldn't grasp the enormity of what she had done. The confession shocked the community. For those who had known the sisters, it was unthinkable. They had grown up together, attended the same school, prayed in the same mosque. To imagine that one could destroy the other was unbearable. At Saima's funeral, hundreds gathered to pay their respects. The atmosphere was heavy with grief and disbelief. The family sat in silence, struggling to make sense of how everything had fallen apart. Meanwhile, the police continued to piece together the final timeline. They learned that Sabah had called Saima just before the incident, claiming one of the children wasn't feeling well. Investigators confirmed that she had waited until her brother-in-law was out working late, ensuring no one else would intervene. It was a plan carefully constructed, deliberate and methodical. As the evidence was compiled, the Crown Prosecution Service prepared the case for trial. The prosecution intended to demonstrate that Sabah's actions were fueled by obsession and envy, not momentary rage. The sheer number of stab wounds, though investigators avoided publicly discussing the full count, illustrated the intensity of emotion behind the crime. They painted a portrait of a young woman who had let jealousy overpower her sense of morality, loyalty, and love. For Hafeez, the emotional fallout was immense. He became a central figure in the media's coverage, not for his own actions, but for the devastating consequences they set in motion. He expressed remorse and shame, admitting that his affair had sparked a chain of events he could never undo. Still, nothing could change the reality that 2 lives and an entire family had been destroyed. By the time Sabah was charged with murder, the case had drawn national attention. News outlets across the UK covered every detail, calling it one of the most tragic examples of jealousy-driven crime in recent memory. The contrast between the sisters, one seen as the perfect mother, the other as the loyal helper, gave the story a haunting complexity. How could love turn to such hatred within a family so close-knit? As the trial date approached, the courtroom would soon become the setting for the final unraveling of this devastating story, a place where truth, guilt, and sorrow would collide, and where Sabah would finally face the weight of her own choices. The trial of Sabah Khan began in 2017 at Luton Crown Court, drawing widespread attention from both the media and the local community. People who had followed the case since that shocking night in May 2016 gathered outside the courthouse, hoping for answers. But deep down, no verdict could truly make sense of what had happened. This was not a story of strangers or enemies, but of 2 sisters bound by blood, whose lives had become entangled in a web of secrecy, betrayal, and irreversible tragedy. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy. Sabah sat in the dock, her head lowered, her expression subdued. She wore a plain outfit, far removed from the bright, cheerful image many remembered. The prosecution presented a case built on months of detailed investigation, forensic evidence, digital records, CCTV footage, and most importantly, Sabah's own confession. The facts painted a picture that was both chilling and sorrowful. A woman driven by jealousy and rejection, who had allowed emotion to override every boundary of love and family. The prosecution's narrative was methodical. They described how Sabah's obsession with her brother-in-law had grown over time, how she had meticulously planned her sister's death, and how she had even staged the scene to appear as a burglary. Each piece of evidence added another layer to the truth. They showed the jury her online searches, messages filled with resentment, and her movements captured on nearby security cameras. The courtroom fell silent as prosecutors explained how her plan had unfolded with cold precision. In contrast, the defense portrayed a different picture, that of a woman emotionally unstable, consumed by inner turmoil, and unable to control her actions. They argued that Sabah had been deeply conflicted, living under the weight of guilt and rejection, and that her actions were born from mental distress rather than pure malice. Still, even the defense could not deny that her decisions had been deliberate. The evidence of premeditation was overwhelming. When Hafeez Rahman was called to testify, the courtroom listened in silence. His face carried the exhaustion of a man who had lost everything. He spoke softly, expressing regret for the affair that had ignited the tragic chain of events. He described Saima as a devoted mother and wife, someone who had never deserved such betrayal. And when asked about Sabah, his voice broke. He said he wished he had never let the relationship cross boundaries, never allowed his weakness to become the seed of destruction. His testimony was a painful reminder that this crime had no winners, only loss. As witnesses gave their statements, the emotional weight of the case grew heavier. Family members wept quietly in the gallery, struggling to reconcile the image of the 2 sisters they had loved with the reality that one had taken the other's life. For the Khan family, every day of the trial was a new wound. They had lost Saima to death and Sabah to her own actions, a double tragedy that would never fully heal. When it came time for the verdict, Sabah's demeanor barely changed. She appeared calm, perhaps resigned, as if she had already accepted her fate. Her legal team informed the court that she would plead guilty to murder, sparing the family the pain of a full trial. The confession, though late, was an acknowledgement of responsibility. The prosecution accepted the plea, noting that the evidence was clear beyond any doubt. In sentencing, the judge spoke with measured gravity. He acknowledged the devastating impact of the crime, not only on Saima's children, who had lost their mother, but also on the entire family who had been torn apart by jealousy and deceit. He described Sabah's actions as calculated and cruel, emphasizing that this was not a momentary lapse but a deliberate plan to destroy her sister's life. He sentenced her to life imprisonment, with a minimum of 22 years before she could be considered for parole. The judge's words echoed across the silent courtroom. "You took the life of your own sister in cold blood. Your actions were driven by jealousy and selfishness. You robbed for children of their mother and inflicted pain that will last a lifetime." Sabah remained expressionless, her eyes fixed on the floor as she was led away. Outside the courthouse, Saima's family and community members gathered in quiet reflection. Many spoke of her kindness, her devotion, and the emptiness left behind. Her children were now being cared for by relatives, growing up in the shadow of a tragedy that would follow them forever. There were no harsh words spoken about Sabah that day, only sorrow and disbelief. The people who had watched the sisters grow up side by side struggled to understand how love could have turned into something so destructive. In the months following the sentencing, documentaries, newspapers, and community discussions revisited the case repeatedly. It became a symbol of how unchecked emotions, jealousy, obsession, and envy can consume even the strongest of family bonds. Commentators reflected on how easily Sabah's feelings could have been addressed if only she had sought help or distance. The story served as a lesson on the dangers of secrecy and emotional isolation, highlighting the importance of communication, forgiveness, and mental well-being within families. For Hafiz, life after the trial was marked by guilt. He often avoided public attention, rarely speaking to the media. In the few statements he gave, he expressed remorse, saying he wished he could go back and prevent everything that had happened. But he also faced his own form of punishment, living with the knowledge that his decisions had sparked the conflict that ended in his wife's death and his sister-in-law's imprisonment. The Khan family's home in Luton eventually fell silent, the laughter of children replaced by memories of what once was. The community, too, carried the weight of the tragedy, a constant reminder that darkness can grow quietly, even in the most ordinary homes. Those who had known both sisters remembered their closeness from childhood, playing together, attending school events, caring for each other's children. That bond, once unbreakable, had been destroyed by something as human and destructive as envy. As the years passed, the story of Sabah and Saima Khan remained one of Britain's most haunting family tragedies. Not for its violence, but for its emotional depth. It showed that sometimes the most painful crimes are not committed by strangers, but by the people closest to us. The documentary coverage often ended with the same reflection, that no one truly wins in such a story. A mother is gone, a sister is lost, and an entire family is left trying to rebuild what can never be repaired. In the end, the murder of Saima Khan was more than a crime. It was a mirror reflecting the fragility of human emotion. It revealed how envy, if left to grow unchecked, can blur the lines between love and destruction. For those who remember the sisters, the story serves as a lasting reminder of the importance of empathy, communication, and the choices that shape our lives. Behind one quiet home in Luton, a family's light was extinguished, not by strangers or fate, but by the devastating power of jealousy within the heart of a sister who lost her way.